recognizing this growing moral injuries maybe will help normalize that these kind of injuries can and are happening to everybody. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means mainly that you're reacting to external circumstances in an understandable human way, and that we have to address these wider social issues to really help reduce moral injuries now.
Hello, everybody. I'm John Atack, but you know that. And this is the lovely Dr. Steven Moffic, who I'm very pleased to call a friend. Hi, Steve.
Thank you. And I'll call you a friend too, for sure.
Thank you. And you brought up a fascinating phrase, moral injury. And so expound upon this idea for us, if you would be so kind.
Yeah, it's a little tricky. It's had a lot of attention in the last, I don't know, months, year in psychiatry. Um, but it's an old term, actually. In another guise, I think it was called miasma.
Yeah.
Back in ancient Greece, there was this idea of moral injury coming out of war. But in modern times, it really got its currency in 1994, and it related to the Vietnam War because this psychiatrist, Jonathan Fay, wrote a book about moral injury in the Vietnam War. Because we were encountering in the United States how criticized the soldiers were for fighting in the war, because it turned out the war was kind of a big farce. And these soldiers were not only hurt by PSD from fighting in the war,
Mm.
but the horror of not being welcomed home and realizing they were probably fighting for the wrong things during the war. So he wrote this book, and it got applied to war in general, but not wider society until
Mm.
maybe a decade or so ago. And it popped up in part in relationship to burnout, which is a big scourge in physicians and psychiatrists,
Yeah.
especially in the United States. About half of us are burned out, but it's also spread to other occupations, to parents, to other countries, not as strong as the United States, but there. But the puzzling thing about burnout is no matter what's been tried so far to reduce it in the United States, it hasn't happened. It's
Yeah.
still at these epidemic rates. And so some nurses, especially physicians, and actually in planning of some of my colleagues and myself for next year's American Psychiatric Association meeting, we focus in on moral injury. And what does that mean? It essentially means that your values are disrupted and you may have participated in letting them get disrupted. So this can happen generally in three ways, it's thought nowadays. One is you're kind of a witness to your values being destroyed around you. And certainly that's happening maybe to half the population of the United States now.
Mm.
One step up is that you're complicit in these harms, sort of the opposite for physicians. It's the opposite of do no harm. It's like you let this happen when you have a chance to fight against it. And the third, I think, relates to cults, because it implies, and was really a strong point of Jonathan Shai's conception, is that you find out that you mistrusted your leaders, that you were fooled by them. And I think people who come out of cults end up realizing that, but you don't realize that when you're in the cult. But of course, this can be applied to other leaders that have powers. And
Mm.
so you end up feeling you've been fooled, demoralized, and then what do you do with that? And that's where psychiatry sort of comes in. We're trying to think about how can we help people who have these moral injuries, including ourselves.
Mm.
And the idea is that there's sort of three kinds of general injuries to people. Physical injuries, which was obviously common in wartime, but is common in any sort of violence to people's bodies. Then there's psychological injuries, and here we get into psychiatric illnesses. Those are psychiatric injuries. Moral injuries are getting thought to be spiritual injuries. And if that's true, how do you address that spiritually? Do you turn to religious leaders? Do you try to infuse spirituality into general psychiatric treatments? This is kind of a work in progress, what to try to do about this. But in the United States, there's growing fear of how it's safe, if it is safe, to try to redress some of the moral injuries that are growing in the United States because of changes in our government policies. So a big challenge. I think it's a true concept. I think it's a global problem. So that's it in a nutshell, if it makes sense.
It does. It's absolutely fascinating. There's so much that I've been scribbling down what you've been saying. Viktor Frankl in The Doctor and the Soul was the first person I know of to try and address the moral or spiritual dimension here and say that when you're treating a person, he wasn't the first to say it. He was the first to, there's a book about it, and it's an excellent book. I mean, Man's Search for Meaning sold millions of copies quite rightly, but he was a deep thinker, and so his other work is well worth looking at. The Doctor and the Soul was recommended to me by a professor of psychology who said it was her favorite book. And here he says you have to allow the person to develop their own belief, to live within their own paradigm, their own context, rather than the kind of Rollo May existential sort of my way of looking at the world works, so we're going to replace yours with mine. May have seemed good in the 1950s when he was putting the idea forward, but now it seems horrifying because you want the individual to develop as themselves, as a person, and that spiritual moral layer, separating that out from physical injury and from psychological and potential psychiatric damage, is a fascinating thought, which is, you've brought to me. I've not really made that distinction as clearly before, I don't think.
Well, two qualifications I'd bring up with what you just said. One is that people being themselves, being their authentic self, is potentially a problem.
Of course.
Because if you're born with a predisposition to sociopathy and that's reinforced and you're growing up, your authentic self is to be a sociopath.
Yeah, true.
That's what we want. And then Viktor Frankl, who I absolutely love and admire, interesting enough, developed a psychotherapy that I think you were referring to, and it's called logotherapy.
Yeah.
The fascinating part about that to me is that it didn't prove to be a very popular usage. It didn't get adapted by other psychiatrists and psychologists very much. Patients didn't flock to it. Its focus was more or less what you said on helping people with what gives their life meaning, because that's what he did in concentration camps, and that's what he said helped people survive in the concentration camps, that you would find a reason to live while you were in those horrendous situations. But it's never become a popular therapy. Now, maybe that's one way to address our current moral injuries, is to try to come back to that psychotherapy and revive it some. But it's interesting that it didn't catch on at all. It seems to me like it should have.
Yeah,
but
me too.
I think people in general, when their moral beliefs are challenged and they think they haven't lived up to them, they don't want to recognize that. And I think, like, to put it aside psychologically, I think it makes us feel too bad about ourselves. So in a way, recognizing this growing moral injuries maybe will help normalize that these kind of injuries can and are happening to everybody. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means mainly that you're reacting to external circumstances in an understandable human way. and that we have to address these wider social issues to really help reduce moral injuries now.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking a week after RFK has tried to close the Center for Disease Control, which
Yes.
is an unbelievable thought, especially given that when he was quizzed by Congress about what he was going to do, he was going to follow the scientific method and he would take advice from scientists, and he just closes the whole thing down. And
Yeah.
the massive social moral injury that's occurring, the division that's occurred in the society, which during the first Trump campaign in 2016, it was very evident to me as an outsider talking. Most of the people I talked to are on your side of the Atlantic. It was very evident to me how polarized people were. Nearly all of my friends were Bernie Sanders supporters, if that says something, who, bless him. But they switched very quickly to Hillary Clinton. And
Mhm.
as an outsider, I had absolutely no faith in Hillary Clinton. It's just based upon her history and what I know about her. She doesn't inspire confidence in me. So it was very interesting to see that this became a shouting match very rapidly. And on one side, the Confederate flag started to be waved, or the Confederate battle flag, if we're accurate here, because the Confederate flag actually looks very much like the Stars and Stripes. And a little historical piece for anybody that wasn't aware that it isn't the Confederate flag they're waving. But nonetheless, a factoid. Nonetheless, that that polarization, and I feel it myself, that you come to the point where you just want to say you're an idiot for believing that. You don't want discourse or dialogue anymore. You just feel contempt for people who are holding on to this, what seems to be a kind of toadying, sycophantic view of this extraordinarily disruptive regime that has somehow managed to take over in the most powerful country in the world and is wrecking that country economically, taking away its soft power. That was gone within weeks. That the rest of the world, for the first time since 1945, completely distrusted the United States. There's a moral injury on a global scale.
Yeah, it's a moral injury against science, right? And
And
I think
reason.
RFK is a fascinating person in himself in regard to that. I mean, first of all, he has a history of being more democratic, an admitted drug abuse history, maybe some brain damage, but he's got the Kennedy name. And I think that lends a lot of credence to whatever he says and does because people associate to the other Kennedys. And
Yeah.
so I think give him some credence that he otherwise wouldn't have if he had a different name and a different history. But yeah, science is being decimated. In medicine, we've got a wide range of responses from organized medicine and psychiatry. Some organized medicine is protesting loud and strong. Others are saying nothing because in part they think their funds are going to be
Oh, yeah.
from the government, which may be true. I mean, when you see what the administration has done to colleges, you know it can happen to your own institutions. Psychiatry, organized psychiatry, has been relatively quiet for better or worse. And so the loyal opposition and Democrats have been, best word I could use, I think, is ineffective. And so there's nothing really on the horizon that looks very positive. And before we started, you mentioned how people think about whether Hitler's ideas are being resurrected again now, or history's repeat himself. I mean, maybe that's true, but the whole ambience coming from the top seems to me to be different. It, it's more of a entertainment way of influencing people. And I guess Hitler could be conceived that way, that he was a great orator and could convince people that way. But I think current leadership is in the United States seems to be different. It's a different way of making people connect with their beliefs, that they're being entertained while they're being infused with these problematic ideas and values. And, it's getting late. I mean, the United States always hopes that things will be redressed in the next election. Now, maybe they will, but maybe the next election will be conducted in a much different way. And I don't think we could be confident that inevitably we're going to have a turn back toward the Democratic Party. And I think that's another worrisome aspect of what's happening. And I should underline, so people know, and any of my colleagues or leaders in my organization goes, I'm not breaking the Goldwater rule here. I'm not really talking about an individual from a psychiatric perspective. I'm talking about what's happening in society, outside forces here. So
and I mean, I always at this juncture will point out that I support neither the Republicans nor the Democrats. That as a historian and an outsider, these are two tremendously corrupt organizations with a long history of corruption. So, the Ku Klux Klan, when it rose to possibly as many as 8 million members between the wars, it was the Republicans who put the Klan down, and the Klan represented the Dixiecrats, the Democrats of the South. So, and people tell me, oh, they've reversed roles. And I'm kind of, no, I think both systems politically have to, there's that point where you have to say, and let's return to the idea of finding the authentic self. Even if the authentic self is a sociopath, you have to find that before you can make progress. You have to accept that. And the power to change has to be given to the sociopath. It's not a matter of locking them up and whipping them to make them change. We've been trying to do this for so long, and punishment does not lead to rehabilitation. In the US, of course, you've got a Department of Corrections, but it's not actually doing much correcting. It's largely incorrecting. It's largely discorrecting. So it isn't about left versus right, which is a simplistic way of looking at the world. The Democrats are not left wing. They're not socialists in the sense that Kropotkin or Karl Marx would have recognized. And to say, oh, there are just these two political dimensions. Unfortunately, all of our political structures have authoritarian tendencies. Power tends to corrupt, absolute power, absolutely so. And we see that. My focus for a very long time has been human predators. For 10 years, I've just tried to say, if we could just get all of our kids to see how predators behave, then they would be a little bit less likely to fall into lockstep behind them. Perversely, Donald Trump has very publicly said that there are only two types of people. There are predators and there are prey. And I think that defines his whole philosophy, and we don't need to go any further. I disagree absolutely. Yes, there are predators. Yes, there are prey. But then there's the great mass of humanity who do not want to be predators and who do not accept being prey. Quite a lot of us accept that there's a position that we're human beings. So we should be creating a society. And their idea is that society must have people in charge to boss us around, tell us what to do. And our idea is that there should be consensus, there should be agreement, and we should progress towards what is for the greater health of our society rather than towards dictatorship, tyranny, and autocracy.
Yeah, it's that middle ground that's really being missed, both in our political parties, and I would agree with you, it would be terrific if we had a third middle ground new political party, but that's very doubtful that that's going to happen in the United States. And the bulk of people, you want to have a middle ground, but the middle ground of thinking for yourself, freedom of mind, as our colleague Steve Hassan continues to advocate, that's hard to get. People are more attracted naturally to the easy way out. Belief in a leader or just, I don't care, I'll just go on with my daily life as it is. And I would agree with you that sociopathy isn't even by himself always a problem. We certainly know there's probably more sociopaths, way more in general society than in prisons. Often they become leaders of organizations, and sometimes those organizations do good things. They like to get power and put their own beliefs on the people, but it's not inevitably bad outcomes. Outcomes usually become worse when sociopaths are in charge, if they're very narcissistic and their value systems are detrimental to the general public,
Mm.
harmful. So yeah, we've really our work cut out for us. I mean, my own thought about psychiatry and mental health professionals is we've got to be more out there in society talking about this. And I think that's one of the drawbacks of the Goldwater rule for psychiatrists. It's kind of shut us up. You know, like we're not supposed to talk about things that are happening in society. So you look on any of the major news shows in the United States or even online, you don't see mental health professionals talking about stuff. It's mainly political pundits,
Yeah.
sort of psychologically analyzing what's going on, and their knowledge base is obviously limited. So, but I think our field has been kind of lost the ball as far as what we could potentially contribute, and we still can. It's just becoming, I think, harder and harder to speak out. You know, people, including physicians, are getting more and more frightened of what's going to happen to them if they speak out. And that certainly relates back to Nazi times.
Yeah, it's a kind of moderate form of reign of terror that we're experiencing thus far. We haven't quite got to Kristallnacht yet, but we saw not simply the National Guard, but Marines going into Los Angeles. We now have the National Guard in DC for no explicable reason.
Yeah, they're
Um,
supposed to come to Chicago, my hometown, Friday. I don't know if that's going to hold, but I just went to Chicago yesterday for a jazz festival. Wonderful. Couldn't be more peaceful, and people looking out for one another and so on. You know,
is jazz still legal in America?
well, that's in part why I went, because I don't know if it's still illegal. You know, it became illegal in Germany, and
Absolutely.
tried to eliminate jazz
Mm,
because it's freedom of the mind, it's cooperating with one another and innovating.
mm.
And so, yeah, I wanted to be sure to see what could be the last jazz festival in Chicago. And that's not to say there's not a lot of crime in Chicago. Certainly is in the inner city, again, for social reasons, but I don't sense the National Guard is the solution. It's just a way to try to keep people quiet and lock them up. And the politicians in Chicago, including Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, who may be a candidate for higher office later, is saying they're going to not go along with this. But I don't even know how that's possible. You know, if the National Guard comes into Chicago on Friday, how are they going to be opposed in any useful
Mm.
way? So that's quite worrisome. I mean, there's some talk that this is a progression of military control of the United States. We're just starting the beginning stages, and we better address this before it's too late, before martial law becomes more widespread. Because if you
Mm.
go to the cities, that's where the bulk of the population lies. So you don't necessarily have to worry about the rural areas. So, you know, just pick the 10 or 15 biggest cities in the United States, establish the presence of the National Guard, and that just controls the power base. So
Mm.
very, very worrisome.
Yeah, and they'll tend to be sanctuary cities. They'll, of course, therefore be Democrat cities, and ICE can go and
Chicago's one. Yeah.
they can go and get the rapists and murderers who are working at the tills of the stores and in the fields. It's the land of topsy turvy that things have turned upside down. Watching the progression of thought, this last year I've researched a book which is about what would happen if a cult, I've decided, because it's the one I know, Scientology, what would happen if a cult took over? And what could we expect? And of course, the parallel has to be Nazi Germany, because it wasn't a bloody coup like the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Civil War that led to Hitler's ascent to power. it also wasn't a proper democratic process. I think his maximum take of the vote at any point before taking power was 33%. But by bringing together, because it was thought that he would be a weak leader, he was put into the position of chancellor, and within 28 days had created a dictatorship. And what is always interesting is, why do we follow? As I say, I've had 10 years looking at predators and try to simplify that and make it appreciable, make it something that people can absorb easily, that this is not a complicated problem. There are people who are selfish, and that's quite dangerous. But the other end of that is, why do we follow? What was it, looking at Charlie Chaplin and The Great Dictator lampooning Hitler so effectively as a half-wit, as somebody who was not anything more than a performer. And I think looking at Hitler, that's what you see, that he wasn't a great thinker, he wasn't a mastermind, he was rabid, and he was also a junkie. He was, taking Pervitin, amphetamines, cocaine, and various other things that his doctor was pumping into him. He was a sick man. He was ill all the time from birth. And yet he was taller than Winston Churchill. Let's be fair about that. He was about, I think he was 5'9", actually. I think he was above average height. Churchill was only 5'3". But thankfully, that's not the entire measure of leadership. But that 45% of medical doctors in Nazi Germany joined the party.
Yeah, exactly. And so you wonder whether something like that is happening in the United States. Not that they're joining such a party, but they're going along with what's happening. I think the other side of the coin you're bringing up is the followers. Leaders like that can't lead unless people fall in. And just a couple of simple explanations about what was happening in Nazi Germany is, of course, there was a struggle between the Nazis and the communists.
Yep.
Nazis won there. But what relates to the United States in a different kind of way, I think, is the economic problems in Germany. They were immense during the 1920s, early 1930s. And it looks like we don't have economic problems in the United States. At least that's what we're told. But go to a grocery store and you'll see the difference between that. But we do. And the economic problems that were affecting lower class white, I don't like that word, lower is bad, but
working class.
That's better. Working class white males in the United States who presumably the Democrats should have helped, but they didn't. And they globbed onto the Republican Party with the promise that things were going to be made better for them. They haven't been made better, but they're so attached now that those links can't be broken, and the Democratic Party isn't finding a way to break them. So we do have economic problems in the United States, major economic problems, but they're hidden by the other half living in relatively good, well-to-do circumstances. So in a way, don't care. If we can just keep going on with our everyday lives, fine. Prices are going up all across the board, cars, groceries, travel, but we have enough money to keep doing that for the time being. So what? So what if the working class is suffering more and more? Something we definitely need to think about on our Labor Day here. So
yeah, that's true. Yeah, here we are. We're talking on Labor Day, and that we are like the Titanic and the iceberg. We are on our way into a collapse of the labor market because of AI. And all of the tech bros are saying it. Our Keir Starmer here, our dear leader, Donald Trump, there's this idea of this religious idea, absolutely, that one day the machine will be intelligent enough to work everything out. But along the way, what we're going to see is a decline in employment, and there is nothing being put in place for that. So rather than finding ways of involving people in society, and I think this was the complete failure of Lyndon Baines Johnson's welfare reforms, that it didn't actually engage people, it just gave them money to stay at home. And there's no system, what we had here, is the education of the tertiary age, where the idea was that when you got into your 50s and 60s, you could go to college in the evenings and learn wonderful new things, which in the end up being, Reiki and macrame. That's about all that's left. Though macrame can be quite useful, of course. So instead of the education of the third age, the idea of a society that's becoming ever more informed, we've actually got yoga cults and all sorts of things that have got into the system, and the rudder seems to be broken. The helm seems to be gone. That we don't know where we're going. What will the world look like? Not in 20 years' time, but in 2 years' time.
Oh
And
yeah.
will that lead to a crisis that actually does, this preparation for martial law, that does mean that the military will be used against the people in despite of the Constitution?
Yeah, the military and the leaders can use AI for their own benefits, of course. And
And
there
AI
is,
is a military technology fundamentally.
yeah, AI is sort of being viewed now, as you said, as almost a religious sort of development, and that AI, whatever that stands for, is the new savior for the country. And I'm not very good technically, so I'm speaking probably inappropriate about this, but there's so much embrace by AI by the younger generation, including people I wouldn't expect to be so enamored by it.
Hmm.
But I just ran across a study which provides me another gigantic worry about AI besides the job loss. So I think it was MIT has done a study about writers and what use AI might have upon three groups of writers. One group would just write as usual. Another group would use AI to help along the way, maybe give some resources. The other one would use AI to write essentially what they were going to write. And then they did brain studies about brain connectivity to the different parts of the brain. The group that had the best by far connectivity development were the writers who continue to work all by themselves
Hmm.
without using AI at all,
Yeah,
which made me feel good that that's where I still am. I
me too.
don't AI at all, probably because I don't know how to use it well, so I just ignore it. But that study says the more we use AI, we may get some useful general information, which is my view of what comes out of
Hmm.
AI. Sort of nice, average summary of what's out there, but it stops our own brains from developing and learning. And
Yeah.
that fits right in with falling under the sway of leaders when your mind gets less and less able to think for itself, then you're more and more susceptible to leaders. So it's another danger on the way. Yes, AI could help discover new drugs and so on. It hasn't
Hmm.
done so yet, but potentially it can. Probably lots of good things, but the dangers are so big and being ignored so much, including in medicine and psychiatry, that just adds to my concern about the future.
Absolutely. I believe two antibiotics have been developed under AI. They're only in testing. One of them is for gonorrhea and the other is for MRSA. So I read in my news feed. I think, yes, letting something else, it's like when, as we get older, there's a temptation to become more sedentary, to sit down more, to walk around less, to move less. And we can now be sure that that leads to a more rapid diminution of powers, because we know that people who exercise, not to excess, but people who exercise will not have as much pain as people who don't exercise. And
Mhm.
I speak with a certain amount of personal reflection there. And while, generally comparing one system to another, the use of metaphors is something I try to be careful about because it's very easy to get caught in it. But if you don't exercise a muscle, then it stops being functional. So, the old treatment for people who'd had back injuries and surgery was you lie them down for 6 months. And of course,
Right,
then they can't walk either.
right.
So you need to, and the same with our minds, we have
Yeah.
to exercise them. I have a friend who was very pleased at the thought that he could put all of his work into AI and it could write his next book. And it just stops me dead. It's like, well, why would I bother to do that? Because writing is a kind of grim pleasure. It's something that takes everything I have and is exasperating to the extreme when I can't find the answers. But eventually I triumph, that, well, so far there is redemption in that I will finish the work. Trying to understand Madame Blavatsky, believe me, that was just like, oh, nightmare, took months. And then one day the penny dropped and went, this is really simple.
Hey, look at all those new connections you've developed in your mind. It's
Yeah.
just
And the whole thing about as you get older, you should learn a language and a musical instrument because that way. But I'm kind of going, I don't need to do that. I'm never stopping. There's always some other. As you know, the last year and a half, it's been Gustav Mahler that I'm just absorbing anything and everything. I've listened to his whole catalogue and sometimes as many as 10 different recordings of a piece. I've been and seen 4 of the symphonies, which is fantastic, and gradually my discernment has come up, and let me say that Tenstet's version of the Second Symphony live, not his studio recording, is one of the most glorious things in the world for anybody who wants to go and get it. I think the thing that I realized about myself, I dropped out of school at 17 because I couldn't stand any more of it, being told what to do. And I think that the principal difference that I've recognized between myself and those who stayed with the course is I'm still curious. And that was it. School was kind of, no, we want to teach you this. And I'm going, oh, what about this over here? This looks really interesting. Can I read Plato instead? And I followed my own nose, which has disadvantages because it means you'll pick books from the shelf that are really of no use to you. And so it's good to have some guidance. But we've now come into a blinkered system. There was a great Daily Show compilation about AI, Jon Stewart and Ronnie Chung. They had some really interesting clips, and one of them was about students cheating using AI. And then we got to an interview with a Harvard professor who's using AI to teach. And that kind of, so why bother all of this money you spend on going to university? Don't bother. You're going to cheat anyway. Save the money, $100,000 or something. You don't have to spend, you don't have to pay a bright kid to do your SATs so you can get into Harvard, and the professors can all go home and the AI can talk amongst itself. The AI can, and for me, there's a kind of foundational delusion. I think the guy's called Jaron Lanier, who was one of the tech bros, one of the developers of this, who 20 years ago broke away and said, you're all fools. This idea that by the singularity, when all the machines in the world connect together to make the great intelligence, it's idiotic. It's not going to work. But the tech bros in Silicon Valley really, you can see it on their faces when they talk about artificial general intelligence. They really think that they're creating God. It's a teleological process where they're going to, and we'll be able to hand all of our problems over to the machine. And there's a great film by the guy who made Amelie called Big Bug, where he shows a world where our AI has taken over and makes comedy of it and shows you the resistance against it. But to me, it's always been the Terminator, that if this thing takes over, it's going to look at us and say, first thing we've got to do is get rid of this scummy human stuff and see what we can do with the world,
Yeah. And you mentioned the word delusion, and well, maybe we in psychiatry should say that this is a delusion, a belief system. That's one of the things we can get out in public and say. I also can't help but riff on what you said about yourself and your own education, even though I don't really like to talk about myself, but I think I followed a similar path as you did, but in a different way. I stayed in the formal educational system, although I always got in trouble for not following the rules. And for some reason, I didn't get a major at college, University of Michigan, but for some reason, I think it was an experiment. Yale Medical School accepted me after 3 years. I didn't have to do a 4th year because I didn't have a major. I didn't know what I was going to do. But what was so terrific about Yale is that we had no tests whatsoever. They expected us to be able to learn on our own, take what was given and think for ourselves and apply it. We had to do a research project. Isn't that interesting? We had to do a research project, original, but didn't have tests. And over the 50 years or so, we're getting to what, our 55th anniversary from medical school. So many of my classmates have had these creative, unusual careers, not necessarily in leadership, but just very creative. And I ended up, after my psychiatry residency, my chairman said I was a gadfly. And I asked him, is that good or bad? And he said, keep on doing it. So I've had my own way, I think, of reacting to education. I must confess, I don't use an iPhone. I think it's too distracting. I can get the information from of what I need just by using a regular computer when I need to. Thankfully, my wife will take my telephone calls if necessary, but I don't use an iPhone. I think for me, it has more disadvantages than advantages, but it's getting harder and harder to keep doing that. It's like if you're among the very small number of people that don't use iPhones, it causes practical problems. But that's sort of the way I think about things and approach things. It's from kind of in the educational system, but outside of it also.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I did succumb to the iPhone about 3 years ago. Well, not an iPhone, not an Apple product. I would never use an Apple product
All right.
apart from my laptop. But I think what you say is sooth, that the best educational system would be one where you are an encouraged autodidact. I do feel, I've had enough time now to catch up on a lot of things, but I do feel that I've played the drums since I was 15, which is 55 years now. And I can do most of the things you can do with drumsticks by now. But I am very well aware that if during the first 20 years I'd had tuition, I could have moved a lot faster.
Yeah.
It does mean that I've come to my own approach. I'm quick, can do stuff. I have a recognizable approach. I'm a rock drummer with jazz leanings. But and that's fine. But I often see people trying to reinvent the wheel, and you kind of going, yeah, you want to learn this for yourself. You want to have this experience, but you're going to go at a slower speed. So having an institution, I think the no examinations is a really important thing. That Finland always comes top of the literacy tables every 2 years in the PISA test, always. And they have one exam at the end of their whole school system. So you're 13 years in the system, and then you get your exam. And
Yeah.
so all of that kind of terror, that moral injury that is, and I think this is true, that examinations cause moral injury, that they make people feel inferior. They make people feel controlled. The last exam I took, I went to art college for a couple of years, and I did what's called an advanced level, which you normally do when you're about 18. In this country, you do 3 of them when you're 18, 3 or 4 of them. And I took one. It was a 2-year course. I did 1 week of reading and got a grade A in the exam. So it's not that I'm frightened of exams personally. I hate them. I hate this idea of measuring people, IQ tests and all of this stuff that says, this is where you are and this is the way you ought to be.
Yeah.
And
And what are you supposed to learn really? Even more than that, we're talking about cognitive intelligence here.
yeah,
There's all kinds of other intelligence which are ignored in our educational system. Social intelligence, moral intelligence, so on and so forth. I think there's, I don't know, 7 or 8 that have been singled out, most of them ignored by our educational system. So the main thing we have is general intelligence, but even the facts we have to learn. And in medical schools, just like you just said about Finland, we had a test at the end, we had a pass. And we passed. It was traumatic in itself because we had to say then, have we really learned what we need to do to pass a national test that all other medical schools have been preparing for years? Somehow most of us did end up passing it, but it was very frightening. And it wasn't attack, it was a moral injury because in a way it was telling us everything you've been learning and the way you've been learning it is not the most important thing. Most important thing is passing the test and knowing the facts that you're going to be asked on the test.
I think we've seen a tremendous decline in the last 50 years. When I left school, the educational system here was probably at the highest point it has ever reached, that people were learning. Not me, obviously, but not within the system. And so much has happened to shift. I mean, in this country, we had Michael Gove, when he was Education Secretary, made the famous statement, we've all had enough of experts. Now, his expert at the time was a man called Dominic Cummings, who would go on to wreck the United Kingdom through Brexit. So he was right that we shouldn't have been listening to that particular expert. However, as Minister for Education, he decided against the advice of all of the experts pretty much, or 96% of them, that we should only have examinations, that the teachers should have no say at all in the aptitude of their pupils, because you can't trust them, because they're not machines. And I mean, on that sense of different intelligences or aptitudes, let's say, and very much with Howard Gardner, who got into a lot of trouble for suggesting that there were different types of intelligence. He really was attacked. And I think if you put the word aptitude in there, things get a little less difficult. But there is a creative aptitude, and that is the thing that is stifled within a blinkered system such as the one we have now. And it might be why people don't know what to do about authoritarianism, because to oppose authoritarianism, you have to think for yourself. So in Eastern Europe, we saw what's being called laughtivism, where people would rebel against a cruel state by ridiculing it, and by doing so in ironic and subtle ways that meant that they weren't sent to prison. Of course, in the Soviet Union, comedians were sent to prison. I think this for me has been the barometer. When Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert and Seth Meyers and Jon Stewart, Jimmy Fallon, when these people are sent to prison, then that's when the line has been completely crossed, and the US will have collapsed into dictatorship. I am amazed at their courage. I am amazed at their courage, seeing the risks they are taking.
Yeah, and even the networks for which they work for kind
CBS.
Yeah. One of the networks has sort of given up, but tremendous courage. And in a way, they're sort of protected in a way. I mean, even if their show ends and they have to stop doing that, they do have alternatives and they do have a lot of money. And so they have options that most people don't.
Yes.
Something you said also reminded me of the arts. You know, the people who work in the arts generally have pretty good freedom of the mind, because they often work to produce new things that haven't been done before. Granted, there's people who just do popular art because they know it's going to sell. But in general, arts are more creative. Well, look what's happened to the Kennedy Center in the United States. That's probably our biggest symbol and really biggest reality about the freedom of the arts, the way it was run in honor of President Kennedy. And that's all changed now. The leadership has changed, and what they're allowed to show has changed. And so it's completely removed this idea of the freedom of the mind and the arts. It's more the arts according to what the political party wants to be shown. And that's another dangerous development. And it hasn't been opposed successfully, obviously. And then we have the whole effect on certain colleges from being defunded by the government, so that they'll fall into a certain line of education that, again, is what the government wants. It's not teaching people freedom of mind. It's not teaching people of different belief systems, culturally and religiously, to get along okay. Instead, you'll just get in trouble if you do the kind of social behavior that the government doesn't like. So all these areas are sort of falling together in place. Where's the refuge going to be for people? And again, can we find a way to fight back? It's so much easier. I found in my own leadership over time and sort of the organizations I help build in psychiatry, it's much easier to destroy things than to establish them or reestablish them. So once so much is being destroyed in the United States, even if the political leadership changes back in a certain way, it's going to be so hard to recapture some of what existed before. It's going to take much longer than the short period of time that things are being destroyed now.
Yeah. It's like socialist realism within the USSR, where Marc Chagall and Vasily Kandinsky both returned to Russia after the revolution and were part of the Ministry for Culture until Lenin declared them enemies of the state and they had to flee for their lives. And Russia was one of the great centers of innovation in modern
Yeah,
art before the First War. And
yeah,
people like Goncharov and Lisitsky, their choice was they could stay and make posters. That
yes,
was it. And we saw these tremendous muscly people. Then the Nazis made a very similar kind of art and burned mountains of Paul Klee and great art. Uh, but I think that
speaking of Russia, I just have to interrupt you to say
sure.
this, but I've been listening to his music more and learning more about him, and maybe you like his music. I don't know. Shostakovich. Shostakovich somehow creatively got through Stalin, the oppressive Russian government, by being creative in a certain way, sort of hiding what he was trying to say so it wasn't obvious, being sarcastic in his music instead of verbally.
Mm.
And he lived through it all and wrote 15 symphonies. Some of his work wasn't as creative as others, but he found this way to get through and still be creative and let people know what he was trying to say. Just amazing, fantastic life and creativity despite all the obstacles. And I think he's a model to think about for people in other fields. Can you find ways of still being creative that maybe isn't so obvious but still gets your point across? So
Yeah, I mean, curiously, this very day, I was reading this wonderful, wonderful book, which I absolutely recommend to everybody. The Life and Death of Classical Music by Norman Lebrecht, the 100 best and the 20 worst recordings of all time. And he is witty, insightful, and has amazingly good taste. I mean, of all the critics I've read, every recommendation I've followed, and I've now followed tens of them. It's his book on Mahler that took me to Mahler. Everything I've listened to that he's recommended has been, like 10 steps second. I've listened, I've heard about 10 versions of the Second Symphony, including 10 steps, one of 10 steps others. And it's there's that one and a version by Otto Klemperer, which are both recommended by the Brecht. But curiously, I was reading, there's one of the discs he recommends is a Shostakovich, which is a piano duet, which he had to just keep in the drawer while Stalin was alive. And
yeah.
I think he's 24 preludes and fugues, opus 87, played by Tatiana Nikolaeva, recorded in 1990 on the Hyperion label. It's in his list of the top 100 recordings ever, and this is out of 150,000 recordings. Shostakovich, of course, suffered mentally tremendously. He
Yes.
was institutionalized more than once. How much that was to just escape, and he was threatened with the Gulag by Stalin, I
Mm-hmm.
think, for the Fourth Symphony. The first three symphonies are kind of propaganda pieces. The Fifth Symphony is quite interesting. The Leningrad, the Seventh, is very good. The 10th is amazing. And if you can get hold of Gustavo Dudamel with the Venezuelan Youth Orchestra, the Simon
We,
Bolivar.
we just heard it at a brief classical musical festival in what's called Door County, small
Mm.
area in Wisconsin. I mentioned that in part because it fits what you just emphasized, and the conductor wanted to play this. But the last piece they just put on was Mahler's second. So this conductor has in mind what people need to hear right
Mm.
now. Yes.
Yeah, The Resurrection by Mahler. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been, the pendulum swung a certain way. My friend Christian Schurko talks about Stockhausen syndrome in music, where there was that dreadful period after the Second World War where it came to be bouncing your cello bow off the strings or what have you. And I think the kind of hauteur that the arts have presented, particularly some of the conceptualists who Maurizio Catalan, I have tremendous admiration for. It's not that I'm opposed to conceptualism. I think he's incredible. Marcel Duchamp, I think, was the most important artist of the 20th century
Tatum.
because he was thinking and how, and there was always humor in his work. And now we
Yeah.
have, Damien and Tracy and Jeff Koons and all of this stuff. And I can understand the popular dissent from this, but that the Kennedy Center is now thinking about putting cats on as a fine work of art. And of course, it was the lyrics were by T.S. Eliot. But come on, guys, at least put Porgy and Bess. Let's do a great work instead. So that kind of Disneyfication of the arts, which is an aspect of a totalitarian state, the simplifying everything, and it's not about creativity anymore and innovation. It's about compliance. It's about all thinking the same thought, all marching in lockstep, and it's so unhealthy.
Yeah. Well, in my mind, there's a interesting major development, in popular music in the United States, which is Taylor Swift. And whether her followers are cultish or not. And of course, her engagement that just was announced with, the football star. And so we have these two really popular entertainments. And are they doing something useful for people or just sort of open for the masses? Taylor Swift, whose music I never followed, I just got intrigued when all this was happening, as I found out, was pretty clever and deep with her use of words and what
Oh yeah.
they meant in her music. And to me, that's really creative and gives the music a different level. So this, to me, is a popular music that enhances a model of creativity, doesn't suppress it, isn't simplistic at its core. And so I've come to be positive about it. It's why I
Yeah.
wrote about it. To my surprise, I could never imagine writing a column about Taylor Swift until this engagement sort of intrigued me, and that she was also turning to the importance of a relationship that in the long run, hopefully is going to be more important to her actually than the music. That's my hope for, and maybe both will go hand in hand.
Yeah, I mean, she's a fascinating character. There's a biographical film of her from her toddler age, and the thing that she's evidently quite remarkable in her writing of music, in her lyrics, in her performances, and the recording of the music. It's all in, and now is the biggest star in the world.
Got
On the
control over her music,
Yeah,
was successful in getting control over the music that was owned by someone else and
it's a,
re-releasing it the way she wanted it to be re-released. So
it, it, the advantage of having signed her first contract at the age of 14. One of the things that Lebrecht talks about is the Beatles being signed by George Martin for one old penny in the pound. That is a 240th. And I've always liked George Martin until I found that out. But after 5 years, when that contract runs out, you get, and if you're still popular, and most people won't be. So Taylor Swift was able to take over her career. She's also, of course, been very outspoken against Donald Trump before in both election cycles. And she's
yeah,
also said to be the world's greatest individual polluter for her fleet of private jets. So
good
life,
point.
life is complicated. And, in the generation before, we have such influence. Paul Simon, Joni Mitchell, people, Elvis Costello, people who managed to say very profound things in Roger Waters, Pink Floyd, managed to say very profound things, but in the end, you kind of go, I can't listen to any more of this. It's too depressing, the post Pink Floyd albums.
Rolling Stones.
Yeah, some of the early songs, and they kept on songs like Neocon. I think Mick Jagger, though he is highly rated as a singer and a frontman, is not properly appreciated as simply a poet, and certainly not by Keith Richards, who said horrible things about him. Waking up in a hotel in Clearwater, Florida one day and going to rewind your cassette tape and going, oh, I must have done something in the night, and pressing and going, da, 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 da. Oh, I wrote that in my sleep, just as McCartney wrote Yesterday in his sleep, which is a very complicated piece of music. Very
Hmm.
strange, the things that people can do. I'm absolutely with Joseph Campbell on the idea that the emergent religion needs to be creativity on the part of the individual, needs to be the construction of relationships by the individual rather than the far off worship of an unknowable God, that it is in direct relationship. And I'm very keen on all sorts of music and lots of religious polyphony. I've got hundreds of medieval and Renaissance discs, and it's just the most beautiful sound. But to me, it's the exhibition of the human spirit of what we're capable of. And when I go to a great cathedral or a mosque, I'm seeing transcendence being achieved by human beings. How we interpret that in a universe, this is what got me the other to it. The Hubble telescope recognized and logged 10,000 other galaxies. Now, a galaxy can be like 100,000 million stars. We can't think in these numbers. The James Webb has now got 780,000 galaxies under its belt. And here we are with our primitive conception of God. You know, uh, God must be pretty big. And also, in terms of time, 13.8 billion years since the Big Bang, which is acknowledged in a papal encyclical of the 1950s. So if you're a Catholic, you can believe this. If you're a Protestant, I'm not totally sure whether you're allowed to or not. But 13.8 billion years waiting until there'd be something you could talk to. So God's very patient indeed. And I think, as Meister Eckhart said, anything that we can say about God will not be true. It's like, but putting that aside, I think the immediate religiosity that we need desperately is personal creativity, is becoming your own authentic, developed self. Eric Fromm's idea of the full self as opposed to the pseudo self, and getting people involved in that. And that's the only way we're going to survive artificial intelligence as well, because it's not going to let us do anything else.
Yeah, I think that's why the term spirituality has gotten more and more popular from religion. You rely on yourself more to establish your cosmic beliefs, so to speak, and what gives life meaning. I think basic religions haven't done that so well, and certainly not the most fundamentalist of any of the religions. That just goes in the opposite ways. And I think, this is a challenge for mainstream religions to be able to adapt to our times and to foster what you just mentioned, to foster people's authenticity and creativity and help them find larger meaning in their lives without just following along what they're being told. And I think that's why there's a drop in people being involved with formal religions, because they're not doing it so well anymore. So,
Yeah, and also a tremendous rise in cultic beliefs, which can be so devastating. There's an excellent documentary
yes.
called Breath of Fire about Guru Jagat and the Kundalini yoga movement. And I've started seeing people coming up, putting YouTubes out saying, I have Kundalini syndrome. And they're people who've gone through this set of practices, and what they need a psychiatrist to sit with, because what's happened to them is they've developed hypomania. They get really high and happy and excited, and then they crash. And they are still, and they're ex-members of Kundalini Yoga. They're still saying, "Oh, it's because we need to keep doing the techniques." And then you take it apart and you look to Bhajan, the guy who started it, who called himself a yogi. He wasn't a yogi. He wasn't a Sikh, as he claimed. He was a complete and absolute fraud. I mean, you can see the method being demonstrated at the Woodstock Festival of Arts in 1969. It's in the film, Kundalini Yoga, and it's completely made up. And this thought that spiritual counterfeits, ways of conning people, the last book that I worked on for you, I was very pleased because I managed to list all of the techniques I could think of that are ways of having what seems to be a transcendent experience, but is actually a physiological experience, staring at
Yeah.
things, chanting, jumping up and down, hyperventilation, all of these things. And I'd never really listed them before. And then at the end of the list, I went, I don't know a religion that doesn't do this. That, there'll be fasting, there'll be over sleep deprivation, methods that induce hallucinogenic states. You're sort of going, okay, as long as you know where it's coming from and what's going on, And as long as it puts you towards compassion for other human beings, all
Right.
other human beings, no
Mhm.
matter what, then I'm for it. That's okay. But unfortunately, we see these ways of individuating people and taking people away and saying, well, you eat Wrigley's spearmint, and I think that's terrible. And is it Gulliver's Travels, the big Endians and the little Endians? We just keep seeing that we're seeing these clashes that are to do with whether you wear, a red tie with a donkey on it or a blue tie with an elephant on it, and how confusing life can be if you get those things mixed up. That we
You
need to
know,
go somewhere further.
yes, further. And before we've put ourselves on the air, you mentioned we might have closed off the last time by talking about families.
Mm.
Well, families are essential in what we're talking about.
Yeah.
How do parents help educate their kids nowadays? And of course, in the United States, we have this common existence of helicopter parents that are doing
Mm.
everything for their kids, reducing their kind of freedom of mind and
Yeah.
their creativity. It's not going to help establish a future generation
Mm.
of people who can live on their own. We have so many kids graduating from college nowadays that don't have no idea what they want to do, which could be okay in a certain way, but it leads them to come back to home, hang around, and try to find themselves. Well,
Mm.
that already should have been enhanced along the development, but it won't be if parents take so much control over their kids' development
Mm.
and don't allow enough experimentation and enhancement of the development of their values, good values, not harmful ones. And,
Yeah.
and that's where social psychiatry starts in my mind. It starts with one-on-one relationship between a parent and a kid.
Mm.
And if that doesn't go well, it makes everything else in the future more difficult. Same in psychiatry. Our treatment relies on a relationship between the patient and the therapist clinician, the
Mm.
therapeutic alliance. If that doesn't go well, we're not going to be able to help. Even if we all we do is prescribe medications, patient is going to be questioning whether the medication is the right thing because they don't have a trusting bond with the psychiatrist.
Yeah, absolutely, and that relationship is everything. And I must say that unfortunately, my trust in authority has diminished. My trust in our judiciary, for example, my trust in our police force. At the moment, my daughter is caught up in the worst scandal that our national health system has ever seen, where more than
Oh,
2,000 families have complained about the maternity units at our Nottingham hospitals, Nottingham University hospitals. There have been, I think, 426 deaths of mothers and babies outside of stillbirths. This has
wow,
been going on for at least 14 years.
wow.
The General Medical Council have not done anything. And we've now got a full scale inquiry with a homicide team. And so seeing the way the white coat conspiracy, and then you have the blue coat conspiracy, the way that people will defend these imagined communities, it's a horrifying thing and very much part of what social psychiatry and your work, what you're looking at. How are these relationships formed? And how do we say, to the soldier, you took your oath to the Constitution, not to the president, you know?
Mhm.
And to the police
Right.
officer, you took your oath to the law, not to your fellow police officers. And to the doctor, well, putting the Hippocratic Oath aside, that the patient is what's important, not making sure that your friends don't get busted for
Well,
the harm they've done.
yeah, I had an interesting experience with that actually for many years. I don't think you have this in England, but we have this new business system that's taken over medicine over the last 30, 40 years called managed care, although that
Mm.
term isn't used anymore because it's too provocative. But managed care was essentially for-profit businesses taking over medicine and psychiatry,
Yeah.
in particular psychiatry.
Mm.
And I was involved with it as kind of a observer participant. And for doing that and for writing a book called The Ethical Way, Challenges and Solutions for Managed Behavioral Healthcare in 1997, the president of our American Psychiatric Association called me evil. And why did he call me evil? because I just didn't come out against managed care per se. Now, why didn't I come out against this business control of medicine? It was because we weren't doing so well ourselves in monitoring what we were doing. So the outcomes in general medicine and psychiatry were not all that great before managed care came into existence. And
Yeah.
so we were as much responsible for poor outcomes as the business companies were when they took over medicine and psychiatry. And so if we're ever going to get a better system in the United States, it has to sort of combine monitoring of our quality of care without profit being the main goal of the system. And that has to be some sort of different single payer system, different than that in England, different than that in Canada. We have to learn from the problems that those two systems have had. Are we ever going to get there? I don't see it in the horizon. But the problem is from both sides. It's both from the lack of monitoring outcomes of care, which could be true in this system you mentioned, versus putting money as the primary goal, not the well-being of patients. So yeah, we've got major problems in our healthcare system too. And we've had all sorts of scandals of care, different than the one you just mentioned, but we've had scandals too that have been covered up because we didn't want to expose each other.
Yeah, I mean the way that Tuskegee was kept
Yeah,
quiet for so long.
yeah,
One of many examples. And there's an Ibsen play called An Enemy of the People, An Enemy of the
yeah,
Public,
yeah,
which really impacted on me. I read it when I was about 20. This idea, that a doctor in a spa town where the whole business depends upon people coming for spa cures finds out there's typhoid fever in the water. And nobody wants to do anything about it because their income depends on it. So a system that is based upon profit and greed, and we are seeing this now. The US now has the wealthiest economy, and the wealthiest people, but it also has some really dire poverty, and you still have very high levels of poverty that's never been dealt with,
yeah.
and very high levels of inequality. There's still gender inequality, racial inequality, and
Healthcare inequality, yeah.
and absolutely healthcare inequality. And so changing those outcomes by saying, what should be the objective of human life? Should it be to make so much money that you can live for 100,000 lifetimes on how much you've accumulated? Or should it be to accept that we are part of society? And I do think that I've never met a happy multimillionaire, and I've met a few. They're so taken up with how important they are. That's not true, actually. I have a brother who's a very good man, and so I'm going to exclude him. Hope he's not watching. But no, he's a really good man. There are people who've done good in the world with what they've earned,
Yeah,
and he is definitely among them. But there are too many who they never really developed as human beings. When I see Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, George Soros,
plus,
Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, who's probably the most dangerous at the moment, the one who's going to seek to take the government over when Trump finally keels over and Vance becomes president. And he's Thiel's puppy. These are supremely dangerous people because they don't have morality, because they don't care about other human beings, because they view us as simply termites, laborers in their camps. Moving from gross national product, who cares, to gross national happiness, gross national well-being would be a great thing.
yeah,
Still, I have taken a fair chunk of your time, and it's been such a pleasure doing so. So thank you.
pleasure too. Thank you.
And please, for those of you who have endured this far, please, make with the comments. And if you have any questions for us, then Spike will probably notice them. And the next time we speak, we might seek to address them. You never know. But a tremendous privilege and a pleasure talking with you, Steve. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John, and may your book have wide distribution.
Let's hope so. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.